Thank you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective podcast. My guest is Julie Smith, who has joined me in the past. So, Julie, if you could just give a little bit of background on yourself and where you're at and what you're doing.
Yeah, sure, Tony. Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it. I am currently the executive director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. We're an organization that's been around as a standalone entity since 2019, with a focus on educating the broader IT community about the importance of securing digital identities. I specifically have been in the identity space for about, 15 years now, with an identity security vendor, and then an identity solutions, or actually a security systems integrator, and then in this role for about 4 years. But since we last spoke, had some changes happening within the IDSA leadership, and over the summer we announced that I've been appointed to the board of directors, and we have initiated a search for a new executive director to lead the organization into the future, which is super exciting for me. And we're looking for someone that can come in and really act as an evangelist in this on this important topic, who's been in the shoes of a chief information security officer or a security leader, who can tell their story about the importance of identities within their security programs and security strategies. So I'll put that out there in case there's anyone that's interested in leading this wonderful organization going forward. But super excited about the future of the IDSA.
I'm confident those candidates are out there. So yeah, if you're listening and you want to get in touch with Julie, I'm sure I can put the contact info in the blog post that goes with the podcast. But by all means, I think it sounds like a very interesting and I'm sure rewarding role for the right person. Although you're a tough act to follow.
Well, thank you.
I want to get to, and so there's what I want to talk about is earlier this year you guys put out the IDSA 2022 Trends in Securing Digital Identities report, and I want to touch on some of the key findings from there, but talk about it in the context of what does it mean for 2023? How can organizations apply that information? But before we go there, I wanted to take half a step back, even though you've been on before, and just talk about a little bit more detail on IDSA. Like how many member companies are there? Member vendors?
Yeah, we've got 33 companies who participate in the organization, and one of the primary ways they do that is through our technical working groups. So those folks, and they're typically leaders in their organizations, customer facing. So they're out there talking to customers, helping them solve the challenges that they have, throw their vendor hats down, come to the table, and work on things like our best practices that we've got published on our website, things like our security outcomes, which are those two things together, really kind of the product that the IDSA creates. And that it's really advice and guidance on what organizations need to do to implement an identity-centric security program. So a lot of the content and recommendations that are coming out are developed in collaboration with those member companies as well as folks from our customer advisory board. And we've got 10 of those leaders in their organizations, like Starbucks and Intuit and Robert Half, Cisco, and they provide guidance and sort of oversight and help drive the agenda, really the content agenda and the focus of those technical working groups. So that's a little bit more than you probably asked, but hopefully that gives a little bit of perspective on the kind of things that we do.
Right. I mean, it maybe was a little bit more than I asked, but that's exactly what I was looking for. Really, it's I think it's just for some people who maybe don't understand the way some of the like industry, I don't know, coalition, like entities like this that exist where organizations are coming together, even competitors, and working side by side because it's for the greater good, and it helps streamline security for everyone. And I like to see those efforts. I think it's good for I think it's good for companies to be able to have sort of a frenemy situation or a co-opetition, where you can say, look, here's the baseline. Like, we can all agree these should be standards, or we can all agree this is a problem and it needs to be fixed, and we can share information on how to do that, and then find some other way to differentiate on top of that.
Right.
I'm happy that I over the years I see more of that kind of industry cooperation going on.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, when I talk to my friends who aren't ingrained in this IT world, and I try to explain to them what we do, it doesn't always come across. And then I point it back to something like the National Association of Realtors. Right there, basically, that's an organization where they're made up of people who compete on a day-to-day basis for listings and for representing sellers, but yet the National Association of Realtors is all about providing tools and resources and education on why individuals need a realtor when they go out and buy a house. Now there's lots of different organizations these days that are popping up, but the idea being, that we're trying to get ahead of the vendors and educate on organizations on how they can become more secure, independent of the specific technologies or vendors or solution providers that they work with.
Okay, makes sense. All right, so then let's move on to talking about the report. Now, I know the report it's been around for a few months, or almost half a year. It's it's been quoted, cited, referenced, but I guess just if you want to kind of start from the perspective of what do you think are the important findings, the interesting findings, from that report?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, kind of the headline, if you were to give it one, is that identity-related breaches continue to happen. And they do impact organizations in pretty significant ways. But there's investments being made, and that's maybe where this could help inform organizations on what they should be doing in the next year. And executive leadership support seems to be making a difference. So that's kind of the headline, if you will. And so if, I can just jump right into some of the specifics that support that. This trends report is the second annual, and we'll continue to do this going forward. But there are variations of this report that occurred in 3 reports previous to that. So it's been kind of evolved over the years, if you will. What the main headline as it relates to identity-related breaches are still happening is that 84% of organizations surveyed said that they had experienced an identity-related attack in the last year. And the organizations that responded to the survey are 500 plus enterprise organizations, 1,000 employees or more, and the people responding to the survey are responsible for identity or security in their organization. So, I mean, that's a pretty jarring number, I think, in terms of the number of organizations that have experienced some type of incident in the last year. The leading one, as you would expect, is phishing. But other things like inadequately managed privileges or stolen credentials or social engineering, have all been the reasons for those breaches. And as I mentioned, they did have pretty significant impacts in the form of, not just hard costs, but also disruption to their business. So, again, kind of things that you read about on a daily basis, the ones that are very impactful, or the ones that occurred within, a big name company you read about every day. But even though this report was about 6 months ago, when it was actually released, I mean, we've seen some pretty high profile breaches just in the last couple of months. So I think that, it was a pretty jarring number. I don't know that we expected it to go up, which it went up from 79% in the previous 2 years to 84% in the last year. The other interesting part about that is that 96% of the organizations reported that the breach could have been prevented by an identity security outcome. And that we reference back to some of the recommendations and the guidance that we provide. And the majority of those organizations felt like they were easily prevented had they focused on the right things.
I mean, I honestly feel like, every once in a while there is an attack or a breach that is truly novel and innovative. Like when you reverse engineer it, you almost have to give it some credit and be like, wow, they really came up with some creative stuff here. But it seems like the vast majority target known vulnerabilities. They target zombie accounts or zombie or rogue devices that the organization doesn't even know exists or forgot they exist. It seems to always be the simple things, so and the fancy things always get the headlines, like when there's a 0 day, that's big news and everyone wants to scramble and go patch the 0 day, even though the empirical evidence suggests that the 0 day really isn't as big a threat to you as a lot of the vulnerabilities that are already there. So all of that I think is interesting, but also, and I think you and I talked about this when you were on last time, I've had the perspective for a number of years, kind of tying identity with insider threat type stuff, and where a number of years ago I was doing an interview and made the observation that the way attacks work now, at the point of attack, they're almost always insider threats from your perspective. Like if you're the security team, it might not be Julie, but it's somebody with Julie's credentials. And so from my perspective, trying to secure the network, it's not like I'm looking for a boogeyman. I'm not looking for a rogue bad guy in my network. What I'm looking for is Julie doing things that Julie shouldn't be doing.
Exactly. Yeah, a poser, right? Yeah, somebody who has gotten a hold of Julie's credentials, probably ended up on the dark web somewhere, right? And now is able to go in and use those, whether Julie is still a legitimate and valid or current employee or user of that system or not, right? And I think that's one of the interesting things that came out of the survey, and this was a question we had asked a couple of years ago as well, is how many, how quickly do organizations typically remove an identity or the identity of an employee or someone who is no longer engaged in the organization? And what we found is that only about half actually remove access to critical systems as well in the day that employee leaves, and only 26 do it are consistent with when they do it. So, and that's one of those breaches you can point back to, at least in recent memory, the Colonial Pipeline breach, is if that orphaned account or zombied account had been deprovisioned, then that whole situation on the East Coast of the United States wouldn't have occurred. So and a lot of people would say that that's just basic good identity and access management hygiene, right? Just
Right.
making sure that you're on top of who has access to what resources, and the joiner, mover, leaver process is pretty well defined and automated, so that when people do leave, or when organizations or when individuals transfer organizations, privileges change based on their new position. So that's one of those things that I would chalk up and say, if I'm thinking about 2023, and where do I need to be focused, and in addition to all the things that drive an agenda and a planning cycle for the next year. I mean, I do an audit and say, how do I compare to the best practices around good identity management hygiene within my organization, and not just for employees, but for my third-party partners.
Right.
I need to start thinking about machine identities, and customer identities as well, right? There's just been tremendous growth in the last couple of years in the number of identities, sheer numbers, and also the different types that organizations have to manage and deal with on a daily basis. And we've learned a lot of lessons with how to handle employee identities that need to be applied to third party, to machine, and to customer identities as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, I think the trick there, the hard part of what you described is it's not the join, it's not even necessarily the move sometimes, although that is kind of iffy. It's the leave. And yes, there needs to be, organizations need to figure out some way to automate that better. But yeah, it's like a squeaky wheel thing. When someone joins the company, they need access to stuff, and you've got managers who are like, look, I hired this guy, we're paying him, he's got a computer, I need you to give him access to stuff so he can do his job. So you're going to get that done. That is not a thing that's going to be like, I'll get to it next month. But when they leave, it's like, whatever. I'll get to it eventually. And then you just don't.
Yeah, but you think about who cares about each of those different processes, right? HR cares about the first one, and the line of business cares about the first one as well, right? Because I want my employees to be productive on day one. Security needs to care about the latter. Security needs to care about when people leave, because that's what's creating this threat vector for their organization. So, that's where like identity governance committees come together, where if you're looking at a security program, you're looking at an overall governance program related to identity, it needs to include HR and line of business, because they come at it from that perspective. But it very definitely needs to include security, because you've left a big hole open.
It also needs to include things that are seemingly innocuous, meaning. And I have a personal anecdote, which is, I don't know that I can actually access anything per se, but there's an email account, an email alias that I, used. I mean, I haven't worked directly with this company in 9 years now, but I still get email that's forwarded from this alias. And yeah, because I'm not a gray hat, white hat hacker. I've never like tried to figure out, okay, what can I do with this information? But I'm sure I could do something. I'm sure someone creative could figure out, even if it's just using that as a means of emailing someone else in the company to create a sense of urgency and get them to do something or whatever. It's just the fact that I have an email address that is on their domain gives me some amount of power.
Yeah, legitimacy, right? So you could easily, I mean, that would be almost a very targeted spear phishing type of attack, right? You could use that email address to send a link, a malicious link to somebody, but just the fact that you are coming from a legitimate email address, people will probably click on that link.
Right. That's definitely, and like I said, perhaps the company, like, maybe they cleaned everything else up. Maybe they said, okay, well, Tony doesn't need access to any of this stuff. So, they might have done a very good job on all the other stuff. I have no idea. I've just always thought it's a little shady that this email address still works.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, just kind of talking through some of the other, certainly one of the recommendations around 2023 for organizations, as a result of the survey, was what are you doing around revoking access to individuals, really identities, right? Whether it could be a partner, it could be a B2B customer. But how are you staying on top of access for those identities and not ending up with a lot of orphan identities, zombie identities? Just staying on top of privilege access, right? And it's not just privilege access of who you're granting that to intentionally, but it's also this mover situation we talked about a minute ago, right? As individuals move around the organization, privileges have a tendency to creep. And so, making sure that you're pretty clear and aware of who has access, especially to, critical systems. And these are things that came out of the, what could have prevented my breach of those individuals that indicated that their organization had suffered a breach. I mean, these are the top things that could have prevented those breaches. Just things like knowing the devices that are that your users are using to access critical resources, and understanding the profile of that device and being able to determine, based on certain characteristics, whether that is a valid device that's getting access to your resources as well. So just, recommendations and things that I think organizations need to consider in 2023. And these are all things that are listed in our security outcome library that we've got published on the website as well.
Okay. Are there, like, either in the recommendations that you provide, or if there are, I don't want you to pitch any specific vendor or tool or whatever, but I'm assuming that things exist that would help automate the hygiene aspect of it.
Yeah, and if in our library of outcomes, the way it's organized is we talk about an outcome, we talk about the benefits of an outcome, and then there's obviously multiple ways to achieve that outcome, and different high-level deployment scenarios, different technologies and capabilities that can come together to achieve that particular outcome. And as part of that, there's also a mapping of these are our vendor companies, member companies who support these particular outcomes and approaches. And so that's certainly a way that you can get some advice on what it is you should be focusing on, different ways you can implement, and potentially folks that you can talk to, whether they're vendors that you're already using or vendors that you haven't spoken to yet. But get, to your point earlier, get advice and talk to them about how their solutions are differentiated and how they can specifically solve that particular outcome for you.
Okay. What is I'm assuming, so correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming that somewhere in the recommendations is the sort of standard best practice of 2FA, MFA. From the user perspective, I will say, I feel like those things seem to be definitely providing security, because a lot of times they prevent me from getting in. Which brings me to the question, sort of, or the discussion point, which is, I feel like there's room for improvement in terms of the process, like the overall process, and the I have the Microsoft Authenticator on my phone and the Google Authenticator on my phone, and I think there's another authenticator on my phone, and then if you've got Duo, and you got this, and what ends up happening is I go to log into something and it's like, okay, well, we need the code, And the first thing I have to do is figure out, okay, well, which of these 4 or 5 apps is that application associated with? Where am I going to go find this code? So that part's always a bit of a challenge. I mean, a challenge is a strong word. It's more of an annoyance.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, what a lot of identity stuff comes to, whether it's two-factor or multi-factor authentication, whether it's forcing complex long passwords, or all of these things. They improve security while making life more difficult for the users. And I think for companies, it's a matter of finding, okay, well, what's the happy medium? Like, I'm not gonna like be insecure just because it's inconvenient for you as the user. But I also don't want to be so secure that the user can't get anything done.
Right. Yeah. It's can you have the security and convenience as well, right? The user experience. Those things have always, I think, in the past, I should have been a little bit opposed to each other. I mean, and one of the things that we would definitely recommend, and came out of the research as well, is that implementing MFA for all users is absolutely, a recommendation. Now, to your point, how do you do that? What are the mechanisms you use? We haven't done a lot in terms of content and advice on that, but we definitely think that, and certainly the research shows that MFA for all user types could have prevented some of the breaches that have occurred, according to our research. Interestingly, a very few number of organizations, less than a quarter of organizations, have implemented it for their customers. And I think that's probably a case where they haven't done that because it does introduce some sort of friction. Now, maybe that's the way it's been implemented is more the issue, or the technology and processes they chose to do that. I think there's also challenges with getting adoption of MFA. So, certainly it's best practice. I think there are challenges with some of the implementations of MFA. In talking to some of our customer advisory board members who have implemented zero trust in their organizations, they believe very strongly in device characteristics as a sort of additional attributes, if you will, or information about the user and the device that they're using to access. That can leverage MFA only when there's some anomaly, right? Only when there's something that's going on that doesn't make any sense. And so if everything is kosher between what the user has entered and the characteristics of the device, then they'll let them in, but they'll throw up MFA in an instance where they need a little bit stronger authentication. So I think there's ways and implementation approaches that can maybe make that process a little bit better. And I think there's emerging standards that can as well. Some of the things that the FIDO Alliance is doing, I think will help out quite a bit as well. So I'm not an expert in those areas, I will admit.
Well, and I was gonna say, the thing you just touched on is there's, if we were doing a Venn diagram of different like security practices and principles, there's overlap there with the concept of zero trust, and a lot of the zero trust implementations now use some form of that, some form of kind of behavioral scoring, sort of, is to say, hey, Julie is sitting at her desk in the office, logging on from the computer we gave her. Let's not give her any grief.
Yeah.
Just let her do her job. But hey, Julie's logging in from some computer we've never seen before. Yeah, let's maybe ask for a second form of identification or authentication. And that makes sense. I think that's a fair approach to saying, look, I as the company, whether it's for an employee or the customer, I am trying to make this as streamlined and convenient as possible. However, there are situations that come up where it warrants a little extra diligence.
Yep, agreed. Yeah, evaluate behavior. Yeah, that's a one I didn't touch on, but I would say that's probably in the top 5 as well. Is, through these, there's so many tools out there nowadays, UEBA tools and the advancements around AI and ML that are benefiting identity and authentication, access certifications even. We've done a series of blogs on AI and ML within the identity domain. And so there's just emerging technologies for sure that I think will continue to improve that security versus user experience ratio.
Yeah. Different, and this is really an edge case, but from a consumer perspective, when there are shared access. So like, my wife and I, let's say like Mint, like we have mint.com, like we have one that has all of our stuff in it, but her phone is the one that's set up as the authenticator. So when I go to log in, it'll send a code to her phone, and then I have to text her and be like, hey, can you send me that code? And I don't really know, I'll just throw that out there for the people who are smarter than me. I don't know what the solution to that is, or is it maybe so much of an edge case that we're literally the only ones having the problem, in which case, why bother?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. During Cybersecurity Awareness Month, that's hosted by our partner, National Cybersecurity Alliance, they talked a lot about just good password hygiene. One of the things we talk about as well is identity security is everybody's responsibility, right? So whether you're talking about protecting your identity as an employee or as a consumer, there's just a basic set of things you shouldn't do. And certainly, using the same password across accounts, that's bad. Sharing passwords, that's not such a great idea. I get that there's a level of trust that exists outside your identity system there. But certainly sharing passwords is probably not the best situation as well. So I'm not sure if that's an edge case or one of those things where they need to enable 2 different users getting access to the same account.
Right. I was going to say, like, if it is an edge case, it's perhaps a situation not for mint.com, or not for Mint to go figure out, or Intuit to go figure out, okay, well, how do I, fix this 2-factor authentication thing? It's more, okay, how do I create a situation where, like a Apple, iOS, like family plan or whatever, like how do I create something where there can be multiples, but they are logging in as themselves? Because I know, like, when I was a network admin, that was always an issue too. It's like, instead of, I could create user profiles for everyone on the IT team and say, okay, well, you're a domain admin, you're a domain admin, you're a domain admin. But at least then when Julie logs in, I know that it's Julie. I can go into the logs and I can say, okay, that's Julie's login. But, we were guilty of it. And I know a lot of people were, and a lot of people probably still are, of just saying, hey, this is the domain admin password. We're all going to use that. But then you give up that level of that granular level of being able to tell, okay, well, but who did it? Which credentials was, who logged in?
Right. Well, not only that, but then there's an example of a breach, maybe not as well known as others, but it happened maybe 2 years ago now, where shared admin password, Oldsmar water treatment plant. I don't know if you remember this one, but they had a shared credential that got access to the dashboard that was used to alter the chemicals in the water treatment plant. Yep. And someone got in there and messed around with it. They got that shared set of credentials. So that's a bad one too. And I guess maybe that, some would say, well, we just need to get rid of credentials altogether and we need to be in a passwordless scenario. I think that's, ultimately yes, but I think there's a long way to get there.
Yeah, because I feel like I am there as much as I can be. I mean, I'm using Windows Hello on my computer. I'm using Facebook, or Face ID on my iPhone. I try as much as possible to just not not have to type in passwords. But all of those things still have a password on the back end. Like there is still, it still exists. And I know there are companies out there that are trying to solve that. I know that Microsoft, made a big push for, removing the password, but it was like a lot of things from Microsoft. It was Microsoft centric. It was like, okay, well, yeah, all the things that are Microsoft, you're good. You can you log in once, everything will just kind of it'll just work, and you don't need to keep logging in. And it's like, all right, but as soon as I go use an app that's not Microsoft, I'm back where I was. One of the things I was going to ask, and I don't know if this is specifically in the report or something that you addressed directly, but you mentioned like forcing password policies and not reusing passwords across devices, et cetera, et cetera. I was going to say, like, I've there was the period of time where it seemed like everyone was saying, okay, well, the password needs to be at least 8 characters, at least 10, at least 15. I mean, I've seen. I worked somewhere where it was like a 30 plus. It was the requirement. And in the push for, well, you need to have uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters. All of the above need to be in there. But I've seen studies and reports more recently that have suggested that that's possibly harming overall password security. That the more hoops you make users jump through, the more likely they are to write it down on a Post-it note.
Right. Yeah, which I think is what, again, back to Cybersecurity Awareness Month, there were a couple of things that behaviors that they were advocating for during the month, and just trying, to create awareness again, across consumers and across organizations alike. Having a password manager, I think, helps solve that long password. They need to be strong, they need to be unique. And if certainly a password manager is going to help with those two things, right? And so that you're not creating, Julie has a cat 123 and then just changing it. Julie has a cat 124, 125, 126, right?
When I was a network admin, and I'm dating myself, but it was way back when, it was around the I love you virus. But we implemented a password policy. We're like, all right, we need to do something about this. So we're going to have a password policy, and it's got to be this many characters. It's got to have letters and numbers, and you cannot reuse the same password. And we set it for like a year. 12 months. You can't reuse. You had to change the password every 30 days. You can't reuse the same one for 12 months. And I remember I remember finding out that a user was literally doing like what you just said. They basically did like Julie May 1, or like Julie January 1, Julie February 2, Julie. And I was like, all right, I think you're following the letter of the law, but you're definitely missing the spirit.
Yeah. Guilty. I will say, and I'm much better, but there was a point in time when I would do something very similar to that. And that, kind of back to the research report, we did ask some questions of both, actually of the security practitioners. So of the folks that were taking the survey this go around, how many of these risky behaviors have you done? And it is writing, passwords down on Post-it notes. It's sharing passwords. It's using the same passwords. It's putting credentials into a messaging tool, for example. And there were shockingly a lot of security people like you and I who know better, but who still have done those things before. Yeah. We also were curious, and the reason we asked this is because we were sort of curious about, personal behavior, because that's always sort of fun to understand, especially from people that should be focused on this topic. But we also asked about it from a cultural perspective and said, how many of you have some sort of leader within the organization, executive within the organization, whether it's someone on the board, someone at the C level, someone at a VP level, talk about the importance of password policies and password security, and protecting your digital identities. And we found that in those organizations and there were 71% of them, organizations had somebody that talked about the importance of securing their organization and the importance individuals play in that. 71% of them do have executives, and the security folks who admitted to risky behavior said, we take better care of our passwords and follow the policies when the executives are speaking about how important it is to the overall security of the organization. So what we are getting at there is it's not just a technology, as we always think, problem to solve, but it's also a cultural thing as well. And I think that's where Cybersecurity Alliance Month comes into play. And I know CIS is doing a number of things, but just to educate everybody. We all live in an online world, right? And even more so since the pandemic. And so, this digital ecosystem we live in is very interconnected, and we all need to do our part to protect it.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say I use a password manager, and I'm not gonna name either, but I used a different one previously that I preferred, because the one that I'm using now, I feel like and this might be a configuration thing that maybe the admin could fix, but so it could be on our end, but I feel like I have to log into it like every time, it's like I want to just go to things and have it autofill and just magically log into things. That's the whole point. But I end up having to log in to the password manager almost every time I need to use it, and the process the process with this particular product, when I do create a new password, it doesn't seem to as seamlessly store the new password or whatever. So then I'll go to log in again and it'll say, oh, no, that's wrong. I'm like, well, how can it be wrong? You're literally the password manager.
You're falling down on the job.
Yeah. So, and that comes back to, that convenience versus security. The products that are out there that are presenting themselves as password managers need to be streamlining that experience and making sure that it is functioning properly.
Right. It's complex space, isn't it?
It yes and no, because I was literally gonna say, as kind of as we wind down some, I was literally gonna say that I feel like there's great information, great findings in the report, and I'll be curious to see what how that trends for next year's report. But I come back to what you kind of started with, which is most of this stuff kind of comes down to best practices and basic hygiene. I mean, it's not rocket science. We're not asking you to buy the latest whiz bang tools. We're not asking you don't need to reinvent anything. You literally just need to not have accounts exist for people or devices that shouldn't be on the network.
Right, and not give access, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to people that shouldn't have it. Yeah, and know what people have access to, know where those assets are that are really your crown jewels and that you need to protect. It really does. I mean, so when you think about, what should you be doing in 2023 to make sure you're not part of what I call the 84% club? Do an audit. Make sure that, just sort of these basic best practices that we recommend, and, certainly I'm going to push our stuff, but there's other organizations out there that have best practices as well on the space. But I think it's, in all of our best interests for organizations to use whatever resources they think are going to help them succeed. But I think it's doing an audit, identifying what we'll call identity debt is, and get on top of it in 2023.
I mean, I feel like, this seems to be sort of a universal truth, that though, we always try to find like what's the cool solution or what's the interesting new solution, but like there are just best practices, like there's always a fad exercise plan or a fad diet, but it's like, well, no, eat right and exercise is a pretty simple, like you can just do that. You don't have to, buy any special things or sign up for a program. You just eat right and exercise. Financially, it's like save some of your money and live within your means. I mean, there are simple solutions to these things.
Right. For sure.
Yeah. But you can go on Instagram and scroll through, and there'll be ads for all the things that will magically fix it for you.
There's something to be said for being pragmatic.
Yes. Well, and one more point on that is when I was working more in the security trenches, I'd go in to do an assessment or a consulting gig with a client, and a lot of times they were coming at it like maybe they had recently had some sort of a successful breach or attack or whatever, but often they were coming at it from the perspective of, hey, we've got this budget, so we're bringing you in here to assess things, and we need to figure out what do we need to buy to fix this so that doesn't happen again. And I was always like, well, hold on, pump your brakes. Let's start with like, what do you have? Like, because it goes back to the what we were just talking about. It goes back to just best practices and basic hygiene. It's like before you go out and buy the shiny new tool and end up increasing the complexity of your of your security, maybe you just don't have it configured right. Let's start with looking at the infrastructure management and security controls that you have. Make sure you're using all of the features and capabilities that exist and that they're configured properly. Then if there's a gap, then we can talk about, okay, well, what can we fill that gap with? But let's not start there.
Mm-hmm. Sage advice.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me once again. And I think this is, solid advice for going into 2023. We can just throw in my eat right and exercise thing because everyone's going to be doing their New Year's resolutions and joining Lifetime Fitness and buying a rowing machine. And it's like, I'm not saying those things are bad, just actually use them.
Right.
So anyway, I have a good rest of the year, good holiday, and we will talk again in 2023.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me again.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.